And I want to begin by telling you what I propose to do. So, okay. Is that better? Can you hear me better? I don't know. We're recording this, so she may need some light.
I need the light for Stan for the recording. It just reflects on it. I know, I apologize, fine. For studio purposes.
Okay, so what I'm going to attempt to do here is a series of bi-weekly talks on the American Revolution. Every other Thursday at 4 o'clock here in the Founders Room. I have tried to negotiate with Henry to open the bar at 5 o'clock, so far unsuccessfully. So if you want the bar open, I would suggest praying or begging or whatever it is. Someday soon we'll get fully back to normal. What I really would like to begin in talking about the history of the American Revolution is to bring to your attention two crucial things that you need to consistently bear in mind when you're talking about reading or listening to a discussion of history. First of all, history is as it's presented by the presenter, whether me or an author in a book. All of us who purport to tell a history of anything are going to necessarily be extraordinarily selective about what we talk about. That is to say, I will not be discussing the housewife in Connecticut who got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and went out to pump water so she could prepare breakfast for her children, nor the slave in Virginia who was picking tobacco for his master, nor the fisherman off the Great Banks of Canada who was fishing for cod to feed the population, nor the farmer who was milking his cow, nor the printer who was preparing his press. All of us understand when we look back in our own lives that we look back on memories that are synopses of events that occurred, and so it is with history. In this particular presentation that I'm going to start in a couple of moments, I am not going to focus on battles and wars and dates. I'm particularly going to de-emphasize personalities. Yes, I will talk about George Washington, but I'm not going to talk about the cherry tree. What I am going to try to endeavor is to take a look at the American Revolution and see if we can understand it in a somewhat different way. Not necessarily deeper, but I hope to be able to illuminate and illustrate different aspects of it which have not been called to our attention in our own education. In particular, I want to try to bring to your attention those aspects of the American Revolution that prevail today in a deep and profound sense on the way we live our lives as Americans. So the first thing, again, is history is selective, and so will I. The second thing I want to talk to you about is something that we totally lose sight of in any study of history, however you do it. And that is contingency. Because we sit here after events have occurred, and because the narrative that you hear from whoever and however you hear it has a conclusion, we assume that there was no contingency in the events, that it was all just laid out in advance. Well, you know from living your own lives that that is not true, that contingency is a part of life. What school you chose, who you chose to be married to, where you moved to, what house you purchased, the color of your first car. And so it was with these folks at the time of the American Revolution. Nobody woke up and said, oh, okay, let's start the revolution. In 8 years, the war will be over and we'll be independent. There was a constant concern as to what events would lead to, what would be the consequences if we did this or that, or we didn't do this or we didn't do that. And it's important to bear that in mind. Having said, or laid out rather, the two things that I want you to bear in mind, that is the selectivity of any historical discussion and the contingency that people actually felt at the time, I want to now begin our first talk more formally. So I want to begin by setting the scene. That is to say, the goal in this first talk is more or less to lay out the basic parameters of what existed at the time. Again, not all of these factors were clear and certain to the people who lived at that time, but all of them were present and molded the events that preceded. First of all, we're talking about an imperial power, Britain. Britain had a series of colonies. The richest of the colonies were not the American colonies, they were the sugar colonies in the West Indies. But the most populous, the most potentially rewarding for Britain was its colonies in North America, and that included Canada. Britain, in and of itself, is basically, or it was at the time, composed of two islands. One was Ireland, and the other was Britain itself, consisting of England, Scotland, and Wales. British history, up to the time of the development of their first empire, which was to end with the American independence, up to the time of developing an empire, Britain was primarily concerned with European politics and the European balance of power. Remember, it was an island, a rather small island in comparison to the size of France in terms of population and productivity. This is the 18th, not 19th century. We don't have the Industrial Revolution yet. So it was an important but marginal power, marginal to Russia, to Austria, to Spain, and particularly and especially to France. So Britain's primary foreign policy goal was to balance off the European powers so that none became sufficiently strong to eventually invade Britain. And the British were extraordinarily successful in this policy, particularly and especially in the 7 Years' War, which we Americans know as the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763 with the acquisition of Canada and other places throughout Asia and Africa and the West Indies, and the defeat of France and the defeat of its ally, Spain. Pregnant in this victory were the rumblings that we will see in the development of the American revolutionary attitudes, And also, it's worth calling attention now, although we'll discuss it a great deal more much later on in the course, the resentment and lust for revenge that the French had against the British. So French policy is something that's going to play a very significant role in the American Revolution, and that policy was primarily driven by revenge. The British Empire was coordinated and controlled by the fact the Royal Navy had not lost a single battle since 1630s when they defeated the Dutch. Every time the Royal Navy fought the French and the Spanish, individually or together, they always won. Whether it was Asia, America, Europe, the Royal Navy controlled the seas, and with that, they controlled the ability of merchantmen to travel and to develop commerce internal to the empire. So the American colonies were a particularly significant and important part of the empire, but they were just a part. The largest part by population, as I'll discuss in a couple of minutes, but not by wealth, as I mentioned, the Sugar Islands. The most significant geographic feature that you need to understand in terms of the history of the American Revolution is the fact that the Atlantic Ocean is about 3,000 miles in breadth. Now, today, in the age of Twitter and emails and all the social media and instantaneousness and jet travel and all, we think in terms of rapid movement. But such was not the case then. Remember, we were dealing with the age of sailing ships. Sailing ships, let me go back for a second. Sailing ships could take 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic if they got there. There was a significant chance that they would be either lost at sea in a storm or driven off course. And we'll see as we talk about the British military policies and their effectiveness that sometimes the British would send several ships to the British in New York, and the ships would end up in Halifax or end up in the West Indies. One result of this is that communication was extremely difficult. A letter written on May 1st might get to America by June 15th, and a response could be received in London in August. So the distance, in a very real sense, attenuated British power and protected North America. And North America was very, very different than Britain. Let's take a look for a moment. First of all, America was a continental size. It was about 1,500 miles from what is now the state of Maine, which was at that time part of Massachusetts, to Georgia, the most southern of the colonies. At this period of time, Florida was Spanish. So it was 1,500 miles and about 250 to 300 miles in depth from the Atlantic coast to the Appalachian Mountains. It was larger by far in square mileage than Britain was. It was sparsely populated, but it was populated. There were about 2 million people living in what we call the American colonies, excluding Indians. Now, I'm not excluding Indians out of racism or prejudice. It's that nobody really has any information on what the size of the population of Indians was at this time. We know that in the southern states, slaves consisted of anywhere from 20 to 40 to 50% of the human population. Slavery existed in every single colony without exception. Unlike Britain, which had the largest metropolitan area outside of Paris, in London, in the world, America was very, very largely rural. The second largest city in the British Empire happened to be our own city of Philadelphia, with a population in about 1763 of 25,000 people. At the same time, London had a population of approximately 250,000 people. So sophisticated urban centers did not exist. You had basically two semi-large urban communities, Boston and Philadelphia, and you had a smaller urban community in Baltimore. Other than that, America was essentially rural. Different kinds of rural communities. So in the South, you had the existence of large plantations, hundreds of acres, sometimes thousands of acres. If you read the story of George Washington and his family, they were, like most Southerners, particularly the plantation class, the elite class, they were land hungry. So the acquisition of land was the symbol of power and wealth. And the more land you owned, the wealthier you were, because you could plant the land using slave labor. A great deal of the social environment of the South consisted of men and women seeking marriage to acquire more land. But land in New England and the middle colonies, New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, was very, very different. It was particularly based on small farming, where the farmer might have a couple of acres. The New England terrain, as many of you probably know, is very rocky, and it was difficult to do anything other than basic marginal farming. And the farming that existed in the middle colonies was more attuned to larger production because the soil and the climate was better than New England. But whether you were producing tobacco, which was the primary crop of the South, or you were producing some barley and some wheat and some corn in the northern communities, it was so rural that there was not a great deal of commerce between the colonies, particularly by road, because there were almost no roads. There were a couple of pikes, as we're on Germantown Pike right over here. People in the Northeast are used to the term pike, and people in other parts of our country don't know what we mean, but there was very few roads to take commerce, the food that was produced by the farmers, very far. So farmers first fed themselves, and then some other people in the village, and maybe if they could get it into some more urban areas. A great deal of the commerce was fishery, and fishing was a huge part of the commerce, and particularly with commerce with Britain. So the British received from the North American colonies usually almost all raw materials, and the Americans received from the from Britain itself largely manufactured goods. The trade was controlled by Britain through its tax and mercantile policies, which meant that Americans were forbidden from trading with the French and the Spanish and had to trade solely with Britain. Now, the issue that's pregnant in all of American history and pregnant today is the treatment of Africans who were imported into what was then American, is now what we know, of course, is the United States. Slavery began in 1619 when 20 Africans were brought to Virginia. It rapidly increased, and the trade was aided by the British. It was aided also by the French and the Spanish, and the French had slave trade in their colonies, and the Spanish the same. But there was basically no slavery in Britain itself. British courts had ruled that slavery cannot exist in Britain, but it sure existed in the South and the American colonies. And it was the kind of slavery that was different than what we recall seeing in Gone with the Wind. You remember Tara and the beautiful mansion, and the slave in the South lived a life of total degradation, a life that was very short, a life that was menial labor at all times, with barely enough food and barely enough clothing to get by. So there was not at this time, at the beginning of this period in 1763, an abolition movement of any significance, either in Britain or in America. One other thing that's important to call your attention to is that the word American had by then attached itself to the folks who lived here. The British viewed the people who lived here and called them Americans. And the British had four major groups in Britain themselves: the English, the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh. And they lived together with a lot of conflict, particularly in Ireland, and some conflict which ended only in the 1740s with the Scots, but they all basically sort of spoke the same language, and there were distinctions of class and there were distinctions of caste. But the rulers of Britain, largely, overwhelmingly English with some Scots, viewed the categories of people as I've described them: Scots, Welsh, Irish, English. And they viewed the colonists as Americans. And why that's significant is that they were being treated by the British less based on, oh, they're from Rhode Island, or this one's from North Carolina, or that one's from New Hampshire, than as a conglomerate of colonists living here. And that impact of that was that the folks living here had come to think of themselves as Americans. That is not to suggest that the loyalty to South Carolina was greater than a loyalty to some entity called America. It is to suggest, however, that there was a distinction. And we will see this distinction in greater detail. But just to go off on a brief tangent, in my research, I found two persons who were royal governors in the colonies who were born in America. Every other governor from the founding of every single colony had been appointed and was either English 90% of the time or occasionally a Scot. So that there was already a distinction in the minds, particularly of the English and the English who ruled the government, between themselves and Americans. Britain was very different in the structure and nature of its government from America. American government was something unique in the world at this time. Each colony had its own government. Its government consisted of a royal governor, but the government was primarily run by the folks who lived there, based on rights that had been granted to them and their ancestors, either by a royal charter or by their own development of their own society, subsequently approved by the British. The best example that I can point out to you of a colony that was a royal charter colony is Pennsylvania. As Pennsylvanians, we ought to know that Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, who received the charter from the King of England, which gave him more than the state of Pennsylvania in size as his own domain. But Massachusetts really was created more or less by religious exiles who put together a government aboard the Mayflower shortly before they landed in Plymouth, in what is today Massachusetts. Subsequently, the British approved the government. So each colony had its own government. That was not true in Britain, or for that matter, any place else in the world. Each colony had its own assembly. Each colony's people, therefore, selected those people who were representing them, largely based on land ownership. In Britain, land ownership devolved by inheritance. So the Duke of this had a son who became the 7th Duke, and who had a grandson who became the 8th Duke, and the lands belonging to the Duke went from the father, the grandfather, to father, to the grandson, etc., etc., etc. Whatever the nature of the ownership was, most Britons, even those who lived in rural areas, did not own their land. America was different. Americans owned their land. And the lawyers among us, I see one retired lawyer, the lawyers among us will know that when you bought a piece of land here, you bought a piece of land in what was called fee simple. That meant you owned the land. You owed nothing to anybody else with respect to the ownership except to pay your taxes. So the franchise, which existed in America, was a franchise based on fee simple ownership of land. And it was widespread, excluding a couple of groups: slaves, indentured servant, and women. So even though a woman could inherit, the daughter of Bob, who owned the land, she could not vote on account of that. In fact, when she got married, the land became the property primarily of the husband through dowry and other means. So slaves, indentured servants, children of course, and women were totally excluded from the franchise. Still, the most significant thing to take away from it is that there was a franchise here far, far broader than the franchise in Britain. In Britain, the parliament was elected by the landowners who controlled what were termed rotten boroughs. So they could have a borough the size of this room, and I had the right to elect 2 people to parliament from this borough, and because I was the landowner of all the land around the borough, I got to choose the 2 people who were elected. Less than 20% of the male population of Britain had the right to vote for parliament. About 60% of the white male population in America had the right to vote. And voting meant primarily voting for your local township government. So when we get to the actual revolution and we see the reaction of the population, you will see that the military reaction of the population initially was based on township militia, people in the town who organized themselves and elected their officers and paraded back and forth with whatever instruments of death, guns, rifles, whatever it was that they had. There was no centrality to the kind of government that existed in Britain. In fact, the very famous, and still exists today in parts of Massachusetts, particularly in New Hampshire, the very foundation of government were town meetings in town halls. So when they had some issue of about a little bridge that had to be built or somebody's house, farmhouse burnt down, they got together, the 87 people or 114 people, they got together without masks. Did you hear me? Without masks. Now she's reading something on her computer. She didn't get it. So in any event, the American form of governments, and they were different in each colony. They had significant differences among them, but they were primarily based on the township and the breadth of the franchise. This was not understood by the powers that be in Britain. Now, I don't mean for a moment to say that they didn't know that town halls existed. They certainly did. And I don't mean to suggest that they didn't know about the state assemblies, colonial assemblies that existed. The British understood in the sense that you and I might understand some abstraction of mathematics. These things existed. I mean, irrational numbers exist, whatever that means to the mathematician. I learned it, it exists, but what difference does it make to me? So the British didn't have experience of dealing with town halls. They dealt through the royal governors, who primarily dealt with the colonial assemblies. So in addition to the town halls and to the franchise, as I set it out, assemblies met in the capitals of each colony. Sometimes they met annually. More often they met every other year, and they would discuss issues that came to the fore for whatever the colonial issue of the day was. And most importantly and most significantly, they passed laws to raise taxes. Taxes, to the extent that they existed, were determined by each colony's local assembly, freely voted. There were no taxes, none, imposed by the imperial government. Now, sometimes the taxes went to pay for the British troops who were fighting the French in the French and Indian War. And sometimes it was paid for supplies that had to be brought in from Britain to fight the Indians. Because most of America was not very far from a frontier, and the sense of the imminence and the sense of the threats from the Indians among the American colonists were very, very, very real. It was not unusual to have reports of massacres, as they called them, attacks by Indians on farmers on the frontier. So the assemblies, generally speaking, raised their own funds for their own defense and for any other necessities that they had. The British sent troops, trained troops of the empire, to defend the American colonies and to eventually, in the 7 Years' War, capture Canada, which removed the second great threat to the American colonies, which was the French. The French had penetrated as far down as the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, and in league with their own Indian allies, threatened the West and the Appalachian Mountains and the frontiers that existed in the communities on those frontiers. The elimination of the French meant there was an elimination of the threat from the French Indian allies. So the societies were very, very different. One other thing to point out in terms of the difference in American society and British society was there was no royalty. You can search far and wide, and if I search wide enough, I think I can go back and remember there was one guy in Virginia who was an earl. Then I think he went back to England. There was no nobility in America. There was no group of people who, by the terms of their status in America, had authority that was hereditary. This was radically different than Britain, where all of the British government was based on the folks who were the hereditary rulers of the country, the dukes, the earls, the barons. They were all formed an elite about the monarchical court of the king, and there was none of that here. That meant there was a kind of upward mobility in society that didn't exist in Britain. The best example of that is Rita's favorite colonial figure, Benjamin Franklin. I mean, he was certainly rare, but he epitomized the fact that there was tremendous mobility in society that didn't exist in Britain. The other major distinction that I want to call your attention to is religion. In Britain, there was an established church, the Church of England. And in Britain, the law was that you had to attend church services, and you paid, it was called a tithe, but in essence it was a tax, to support the local clergyman and the local church. You paid this tax whether you were Anglican, or you were Catholic, or you were Protestant dissenters. There weren't very many Jews or Muslims in Britain. That was not the case here. In Britain, the Anglican Church was an Episcopal church with bishops who appointed the priests in the parishes. Even the Catholic Church, which was largely underground, was Episcopal. The Queen or King was the head of the Anglican Church who appointed the bishops who appointed the clergy. Not so here. There were Anglican clergy here, but, and it strikes me as, I have no explanation, but America never got a bishop of the Anglican Church from Britain. That meant fundamentally that whatever the nature of the organization, the Puritans in New England, the Protestant groups, the Congregationalists, eventually some wildly radical people like the Baptists, all controlled their own religious organizations. They controlled their own congregations. They controlled the payment to sustain their congregations. The final factor that I want to talk about that was different, and in some respects, well, let me go back 1 second. In some respects, it was the most profound difference. America was a frontier society. It was a frontier society, not so much in the sense that there were Indians out there that were a threat. It was a frontier society in the sense that there was absolute, total, complete freedom of movement. So if you were unhappy in Plymouth Township, for heaven's sake, you went over to Dauphin Township. And if that wasn't far enough, you found yourself out in the real sticks in what turned out to be Allegheny Township. So people were constantly on the move. Not simply a function of, I'm dissatisfied, I don't like it here. There was a lot of that. But as a result of massive immigration into America. There was no immigration service. Children were not separated from their parents and put in cages. People just moved here. They didn't need anybody's permission to move here. They just moved here. Because the idea began to spread in Europe, and particularly in Britain, in Scotland and in Ireland, and in Europe, particularly in Germany, that there was opportunity here, that there was independence of personality, that there were no ruling classes, that there was religious freedom, and there was land. For almost a generation, approximately 3 to 4% of the population annually in Scotland left and immigrated to America. The German population primarily immigrated to Pennsylvania, in what we call Pennsylvania Dutch now. So the idea of America growing, changing, being more fluid, being more flexible, scam likely. Hey, you did that deliberately. Come on. Becca, we knew. And it said Jenkintown, Becca. So America was already a different society. Now, it's also true that by solely focusing on the differences, we don't give sufficient attention to what was similar. And the similarities were profound. Language, religion. As I said, there were almost no Jews in there. I can't imagine it was even a Muslim in America. So whether you were Catholic or Baptist or Anglican, you were Christian. The organization of the family. There were basically husband and wife, and that was it. And people married, and people wanted to be married. And people wanted to raise children. Now, I'm not suggesting that homosexual folks didn't exist, because surely they did. But the predominance of the culture was a culture of husband, wife, children, family, grandparents, grandchildren. And Americans were loyal to the British Crown. Americans fought with the British troops. Americans joined the Royal Navy. Americans fought repeatedly in the French and Indian War. George Washington was one of the leaders of the Virginia militia. And they fought with the British. George Washington's great goal at that time was to become a British regular officer. And he was turned down because he was a colonial. But they were loyal to the crown. Whether or not they came from Scotland, they came from Ireland, they came from England, Wales, they were loyal British citizens. And it is a mistake of a great order of magnitude to forget that. Because later in the course, we're going to talk a little bit about the Loyalists. When the revolution started, when it came to its height, when it came through its stressful times, throughout those years, there was a significant portion of the American population that opposed the revolution. Significant. Some have estimated up to a third. So we need to take that into account. The British government, and we'll get to this in another three lessons. The British government was essentially a unitary government. The king in Parliament. I said that correctly. The king in Parliament, or the sovereign in Parliament. That meant that the king had significant power, not the power of Henry VIII, but significant power, particularly when it came to foreign and colonial affairs. And the king at this time was George III. There was a movie made about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. I think it was called The Madness of the King, or I'm not sure what the title was. Okay, The Madness of King George. King George III eventually suffered severe psychotic breaks, later in life. But at the period of time we're talking about, he was full of all of his faculties. He was a dedicated imperialist. He loved the British Empire. He loved the Royal Navy. He loved the government. He wanted money to be spent to constantly expand the empire. His view of the empire was all Britons were going to be loyal to him. He was the sovereign. And the power of Parliament was primarily a power of the purse, a power of raising taxes or not. So you would think, if you take the later model, the current model of British government, where the Queen just does nothing, basically, that the Parliament really controlled the government. But at that time, that was not so. It was not so because not only did the king have his own authority and power, but he had the ability to have the government, which was largely made up of parties loyal to him personally. It was then called the Tory Party, it still is, and the more liberal party, more considerate of the American colonies' point of view, were called the Whigs. But in any event, at the period we're beginning, and without getting into all the details of British politics, the king, through his own authority and through the party that supported him in Parliament, controlled completely the governance of the colonies, so that there was no constraint on his authority. George III was, because of his subsequent psychotic breaks, it's difficult to use the proper terminology because I don't want to implicate that. That was not present. But he was extraordinarily dedicated to the idea of resisting the American Revolution and resisting the revolutionary ideas that have been and were being propounded. He was the last obstacle to any potential peace settlement. And when the war turned against the Brits, he was the last one willing to recognize the independence of the United States. So his power in this and his control of the government, before things got really bad and when they did, is something we will come back to a number of times. I am repeating myself a little bit here. I did mention to you, and we'll talk about immigration, so I have some statistics here for you. In the population of America and the colonies around 1700 was 1/10 of the size it was 70 years later. And all of that, almost all of that, was a result of immigration. So America had become a magnet for Europe. Americans also were significantly healthier than Britons. The British folks who lived in London lived in what would be fairly termed a polluted, highly polluted society. There was no sewage. Everything was dumped into the streets. There was no fresh air because the chimneys were now pumping out the coal, which we now know is deadly. Americans were taller, stronger, and lived longer. They lived an outdoor life, an active life. They exercised without going to exercise class. So American society was different enough to become a significant source of problems for the British. And we will see next time how the victory over the French laid the groundwork for the beginnings of the revolutionary movement in America. So I will see you in 2 weeks. Hopefully Rebecca will not report us if we take our masks off in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, thank you. It's very kind of you, and I appreciate that, I really do. Anybody have any questions? Yes, Mary Sue, I have a hearing problem, and Rebecca is going to give you permission.
It's a dumb question, but I want to know about the French. Where else was the war in Europe? You know, when we didn't, the English didn't just beat France here.
Oh, they beat the French. They beat, well, the British in the 7 Years' War, it was a 7 Years' War. That ended in 1763. It began in 1757. They beat the Spanish and took Gibraltar. They beat the French in India and took what was then called Bombay, which we now call Mumbai. They beat them in the West Indies, and I forget which colony, honestly, I just forget which colony they took. And they beat the Spanish. I mean, the war started off poorly for Britain, but turned when William Pitt became prime minister. He was absolutely brilliant and knew how to mobilize their resources, and they had allies on the continent, and they fought and they beat the French. I mean, the British troops in 1763, I'm not talking about the Royal Navy, the British troops were the best military in the world at that time.